Let me start by thanking the National Institute of Legislative and Democratic Studies for organizing this very important maiden edition of the Distinguished Parliamentarians lecture series. Before I start to read my lecture, let me say that it is the right thing to do because of the three arms of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The legislature is more representative of the people or citizens than the other two arms. And therefore, providing a platform like this one is a golden opportunity for exchange of ideas, a marketplace of ideas for the legislature to tell its story, but also for the legislature to listen to the people it represents. And therefore, having a platform like this will be an opportunity for us in the legislature to engage with people, not only tell our stories, because our stories are the stories of the people, to be told by us. And what they say is what they think about the legislature. I'm therefore so opportuned to be the first guest lecturer, and I cannot thank the NILS enough for this opportunity. I'm honored by the privilege given to me to present the maiden lecture at the Distinguished Parliamentarians lecture series, organized by the National Assembly and facilitated by the National Institute for Legislative and Democratic Studies, NILS. I'm also humbled by the onerous responsibility to have led the 9th Assembly. May I use this special occasion to salute and commend distinguished colleagues and honor members who have made the historic journey with us and contributed to our numerous achievements. Leaders of both chambers have demonstrated the highest standards expected of leaders, inspiring colleagues through the most trying of times and placing themselves entirely at the service of the Nigerian people, even in those days and occasions when the pool of partisan loyalties and the inbred tendency of the democratic practice to work to place difficulties in managing particularly difficult times and issues. We found strength in our collective leadership and in President Muhammad Buhari to provide leadership that will justify the mandates given to us by Nigerians. Those mandates included reducing damage, preserving hope and confidence, and dealing with a myriad of problems, which include widespread insecurity, poverty, and a restless bulge of Nigerian youth looking for answers from a country that should promise and deliver much. I would like to thank all of you for taking your time out of your busy schedules to attend and listen to this all-important lecture on legislature, legislative mandate, and people, reality, and the public perception. This lecture series represents a profound statement that the legislature, particularly the National Assembly, is elevating accountability to the people we represent to unprecedented levels. The lecture seeks to do three things. In the first instance, it will discuss the legislature and legislative mandate largely from a theoretical perspective to establish the importance of the legislature as a cardinal institution of democracy in our system. The powers and functions of the legislature will be examined, as well as the various ways in which scholars have conceptualized the role of the legislature in shaping and promoting laws and policies and holding the executive to account. In the second part of the paper, the issue of public perception of the legislature is examined in a comparative perspective to understand some of the factors that contribute to the misperception and misunderstanding of the legislature and how that affects the legitimacy of the legislature in particular and democracy as a whole. Thirdly, the paper presents what I consider as the reality in courts of the legislature beyond the negative characterization and public perception. Hence, this lecture is in part an honest attempt to place on record the manner in which the Ninth National Assembly is discharging its obligations. It concludes with concrete recommendations on how to improve public understanding of the legislature and by so doing, improve perception, participation, and engender greater trust in the legislature as the cornerstone of our democracy. Conceptual clarifications. The topic legislature, legislative mandate and people, reality and public perception is indeed dense. To do justice to the topic, it is critical that I first unpack some of the theoretical underpinnings of the concepts in the topic. This is undertaken not only in a purely academic sense, but within the context of the presidential democracy that we operate in Nigeria. It is also done with a view to show the interrelatedness of the concepts and how general understanding or misunderstanding of the role of the legislature within a democratic context can and does indeed contribute to widespread misperception of the roles of the various arms of government. Let me start with the legislature. First, the legislature of any democratic nation occupies a key or central position in the machinery of government. It is considered the first arm of government, representing the very essence of democracy. For without the legislature, which consists of the people's representatives, there can be no democracy. Hence, traditionally, the legislature is treated with special respect because of its role in democratic governance. As poignantly expressed by Andrew Hewitt, the legislature is the symbol of popular representation. It is also the foundation of liberal democratic governance. Mize defines the legislature as a predominantly elected body of people that acts collegially and has at least the formal but not necessarily the exclusive power to enact laws binding on all members of a specific geopolitical entity. Importantly, the legislature forms the most important buffer against tyranny, given that it is a representative institution ideally established to represent citizens and reflect the range of citizens' preferences as expressed in elections. Traditionally, the legislature is vested with the formal powers of lawmaking, oversight, and representation. Reality versus perception in the assessment of the legislature. Distinguished participants at this distinguished lecture, let me throw some light on the question of reality and perception as it affects my assessment of the national legislature this morning. I do this because the crafters of the title of this lecture have a clear idea that reality and perception provide powerful lenses that can throw enormous light on the performance of the legislature. Here I turn to the field of social psychologists, where the categories of reality and perception have engaged the attention of scholars over the years. The first point to make is that reality and perception are intertwined in the way they are employed in social analysis. One could further suggest that the relationship between the two is not only complex but dialectical. The second point is that social perception and social beliefs, which share the same meaning, can be used to refer to a variety of constructs such as expectations, stereotypes, intuitive and implicit theories, and hypotheses. What this means is that what we call perception is not a given, and to that extent, it is a product of meanings that people make out of existing realities as evaluated on the basis of their expectations, beliefs, and dispositions. In other words, it is the reality that people construct on their own in terms of both individual and collective evaluation and judgment. Some writers have argued, and correctly so, that perception, and in quote, goes beyond the information given, end of quote. Applied to the Nigerian legislature, which is the focus of this lecture, the point being made is that the legislature may provide a deluge of information regarding its activities in terms of the quantum of bills passed, including their high-impact nature or how it has contributed to improving governance and public accountability, but may not necessarily sway the opinion of citizens and the general public. The important point to note, therefore, is that social perception creates social realities as much or more than it reflects social reality. This point led the philosopher W.T. Thomas to conclude as follows, and in quote, "If men define a situation as real, they are real in their consequences," end of quote. The issue of reality and perception will fall within the realm of the science of subjective experience, could imply, on the one hand, that people's errors, prejudices, and misbegotten beliefs can create social reality. On the other hand, it could mean that people's perception often may reflect social reality, and even when erroneous, these perceptions do not necessarily have much influence on social reality. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, democracy, by its very nature, spurs citizens to form opinions on several issues. Almost any matter on which the executive or legislature has to decide may become a public issue if a significant number of people wish to make it one. The attitudes of citizens to government actions and programs, laws and policies, as well as processes based on their beliefs, belong to what we refer to as public perception. In this regard, the concept is closely related to, and sometimes used interchangeably with, the public opinion, which is understood as the majority view on a public issue after it has been discussed in the public arena. Public opinion is considered not only as a true basis of power and legitimacy, but could significantly improve governance. Suffice it to say that these attitudes and perceptions are often molded by external factors that include news media, interest groups, civil society, and others. When used within the context of Parliament, public perception refers to the image of the legislature and its members, trust in the institution and lawmakers, openness of legislative proceedings, media coverage, and how the legislature itself reacts to public perception. The legislature and legislative mandate. Beyond these traditional powers, the legislature, especially in presidential system that we run in this country, undertakes more specialized functions that are not necessarily associated with their core functions. This has led to the categorization of the legislature as a flexible institution capable of performing several different functions within a political system. Notwithstanding the different foresee of the individual parliaments, their core functions relate to representation, legislating, oversight, deliberation, budget setting, and redressing grievances. In view of these functions of the legislature, it is important to also consider how the discharge of these functions is tied to the nature of any given assembly. There have been several notable attempts by legislative scholars to assess the varying changes in the role being played by legislatures around the world. The attempts by these scholars resulted largely in various typologies, all attempting to show how the legislature can and does make an impact on the processes of governance. For instance, Nelson Cosby distinguishes between arena legislatures, whose roles are purely limited to considering and scrutinizing legislations proposed by the executive with little or no input by the assembly itself. The role of such legislatures is purely deliberative and is predominant in parliamentary systems. On the other end of the spectrum, however, you consider some legislatures, especially those in the presidential system, as transformative. A prime example of such a legislature is the US Congress and the Nigerian National Assembly. These are legislatures that are capable of proposing, amending, and rewriting executive proposals. The quality of debates in these legislatures are robust, and substantial resources are committed to ensuring that the legislature is well-resourced to perform its role as a counterbalance to the already powerful executive. In his seminal work on the legislature, Michael Mezi assesses the policy-making impact of the legislatures and distinguishes between parliamentarians and parliaments that have either weak or little impact on policy. Suffice it to say that policy-making is often constructed or construed as an executive function. Increasingly, however, legislatures around the world are asserting more influence on government policies and sometimes contributing positively in both policy evaluation and formulation. Those legislatures with strong policy-making impacts can reject or modify legislations. Based on the degree of influence a legislature asserts in the policy process, Meze classifies legislatures as either minimal, marginal, reactive, vulnerable, or active. This classification is essential to distinguish the role played by various parliaments around the world. However, it has an important implication on how a given legislature understands and performs its role and what the public should expect of that legislature. In the case of legislatures in the lower spectrum, there is clearly very little by way of public expectation, given that the roles of these legislatures play are considered only marginal. However, in active legislatures such as ours, the public expects vigorous engagement with executive proposals, robust oversight, and well-developed systems of legislative representation. Another prominent scholar, Lord Philip Norton, a member of the UK House of Lords, takes Meze's argument a step further by distinguishing between policy endorsing, policy making, policy and policy influencing legislatures. At the farthest end of the spectrum are legislatures that can neither modify nor reject executive proposals, nor can they formulate policies of their own. Next in line are those that exercise marginal influence on policy largely by virtue of their power to modify or reject. Then there are policy-making legislatures that can do all three, that is, modify, reject, or formulate policies. Once again, in a presidential democracy like Nigeria's, the legislature is expected to be a policy-making assembly with the requisite capacity to interrogate proposals submitted to it and also generate its proposals insofar as it is intended to contribute towards good governance and the general welfare of the citizens. Whether a legislature falls into any of these categories discussed above, and its ability to effectively discharge its mandate is predicated on several factors. According to the Interparliamentary Union, IPU, 4 major factors help determine how a legislature undertakes its duties. The first is the legislature's institutional and legal framework, which defines its powers in relation to those of the executive and judiciary. It also specifies the tools and methods that a legislature may use to exercise its powers. In Nigeria, the legislative powers of the National Assembly and State House of Assembly are amply guaranteed in the 1999 Constitution as altered. Second, in many parliaments, committees are the principal forum for discussing and debating policies and conducting oversight activities. Having a strong committee system is an important determinant of the effectiveness of a legislature in implementing its powers. Third, strong legislators rely on strong organizational structures. The funding available to the legislature and how it accesses these funds is an important aspect of its autonomy and independence. For legislators to effectively perform their duties, the legislative administration must be able to provide them with the support and information that they need. Finally, political parties and groups play an important role in determining the positions taken by lawmakers and decisions on when and how to use the powers vested in the legislature. Now, the legislature in Nigeria. The mandate of a Nigerian legislature, comprising a bicameral National Assembly and unicameral State House of Assembly, are clearly spelled out in the 1999 Constitution. In Section 4, subsection 1, vests legislative powers of the Federal Republic of Nigeria in the National Assembly, stating that it shall have the powers to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of the Federation with respect to any matter included in the exclusive legislative list set out in Part 1 of the second schedule to the 1999 Constitution, while Section 4, subsection 7, contains a similar provision in relation to the State House of Assembly with respect to matters contained in the concurrent legislative list and matters not provided in the exclusive or concurrent list, otherwise known as residual list. The wide gamut of legislative powers as it relates to various subject matters are equally well captured in the 1999 Constitution and include the power to authorize expenditure from Consolidated Revenue Fund of the Federation or states through appropriation laws in Section 81 and Section 121, powers to establish contingency funds and other public funds of the Federation or states, and the power to make laws for the Federation or the state with respect to the maintenance and securing of public safety and public order, and providing, maintaining, and securing of essential supplies and services as espoused in Section 11. Other powers include that of oversight, which confers authority to initiate an investigation into any matter on which the National Assembly or State House of Assembly can make laws, power to confirm appointments of chairmen and members of established executive bodies, power to approve the appointments and removal of judicial officers of the various courts, as provided for in Chapter 7 and Section 292. These and other powers conferred on the legislature in Nigeria are not arbitrary but carefully crafted to ensure an effective check on any potential excesses on the part of the executive. However, let me state categorically from the outset that in Nigeria's presidential democracy, the three arms of government, the legislature, the executive, and judiciary, are each vested with powers over some defined activities of government. In many respects, joint efforts and collaborations are constitutionally required in the exercise of their powers. This is to enhance the performance of the organs ensure harmonious inter-organ relations, and guarantee the independence of the legislature. I will return to this when I discuss the executive-legislative relations in the 9th National Assembly. Suffice it to say also that the exercise of legislative powers by the National Assembly or by a state house or assembly are not unlimited. The 1999 Constitution clearly states that unless otherwise provided, the exercise of legislative powers shall be subject to the jurisdiction of courts of law and judicial tribunals established by law, and accordingly, the National Assembly or a House of Assembly shall not enact any law that ousts or purports to oust the jurisdiction of a court of law or a judicial tribunal established by law. Also, Section 1, Subsection 3 asserts the supremacy of the Constitution by limiting the powers of the legislature. Next, I would like to speak on the public perception of the legislature. Having considered the mandate of the legislature, its powers and limitations, it is also vital that I briefly discuss the relationship between legislative mandate and public perception, which forms an important part of the topic under consideration today. The literature on the legislature throws substantial light on the issue of public expectation of the legislature and how public perception of its role contributes to legitimizing democracy. Public trust is an essential lubricant for the workings of any political system. Good governance does not rely solely on the mechanical enforcement of administrative standards or the legal enforcement of constitutional rules. It also requires that citizens share a widespread culture of social confidence that public officials and the institutions they represent will instinctively do the right thing in court. In a democracy, for example, citizens ought to be able to reasonably expect that public officials will govern on their behalf. If, however, government officials are perceived to violate the public's trust, then people will feel justified in withholding their voluntary compliance. Being the first arm of government and the closest to as well as the most accessible by the people, the legislature easily lends itself to public scrutiny and sometimes is meant to take the blame even for government decisions that fall outside its legislative competence. Moreover, the legislature does not always enjoy a positive image. A study by the Hansa Society in the UK showed that public confidence in Parliament has been rapidly declining over the past several decades. A few years ago, the Hansa Society's annual audit of political engagement turned up some shocking results. And here are the results. It revealed that the majority of the UK public, and that is 54% of them, feel they know little or nothing about politics, that barely a majority find it of interest, about 53% of them. Only a small minority are politically active, and that is just 16% of them. A similar study by the Israeli Parliament, termed Public Trust in Parliament, a comparative study, equally made some alarming revelations. The study surveyed 21 parliaments in Western democracies. It found a worldwide problem of low levels of trust in government institutions in general and in Parliament in particular. This is despite reforms and innovations introduced by many parliaments to improve the connection between themselves and the public. Data from the Eurobarometer regarding 15 EU states revealed that the average rate of trust in the Parliament declined from 49% in 1996 to 39% in 2005. Even in the US, the average American thinks that Congress is a waste of taxpayers' money. The annual Gallup in 2014 showed that trust in the judicial branch held relatively steady over a 43-year period, registering at 61% in 2014. Trust in the executive fell to 43%, but the most precipitous decline by far was for the legislative branch, the US Congress. In 2014, Only 28% of Americans said they had a great deal or fair amount of trust in Congress, a drop of 44 points. Incredibly, 1 out of every 5 Americans. The situation is no different in Africa, as shown by findings from round 6 of the Afro-Barometer survey, covering 36 countries on the continent. Key findings from the survey show that across 36 countries in 2014-2015, Africans express more trust in informal institutions such as religious and traditional leaders, amounting to 72% and 61% respectively, than in the formal executive agencies of the state, on average 54% only. Additionally, people find certain executive agencies, such as the National Army and the State Presidency, to be quite trustworthy, especially when compared with legislative and electoral institutions. Popular trust in the executive institutions of the state was shown to vary considerably across African countries, from more than 80% in Niger and Burundi to less than 40% in Nigeria, Liberia, and Sao Tome and Principe. There is, however, good news about the Nigerian National Legislature in terms of its public perception and what this means for the future of Nigeria's democracy. Over the years, the image of the Nigerian National Assembly has improved, and there is considerable support from citizens who increasingly perceive it as an important institution that should be preserved to give democracy a chance. In other words, it is increasingly an institution that citizens will be willing to defend against the onslaught of anti-democratic forces. Let me, at this point, leverage on the perception survey of the National Legislature undertaken by our own National Institute for Legislative and Democratic Studies, NILS, as recently as 2020. The study deployed scientific methodology in all ramifications, including a sampling method that covered the entire 6 geopolitical zones. Among others, the study sought to gauge citizen perception of legislators/legislatures, especially the Ninth Assembly, against the concern that they are overshadowed by the executive and the perceived low level of the legitimacy of the legislators because of issues of corruption, sleaze, and other ethical concerns. But even more importantly, the study sought to establish citizens' level of knowledge. Citizens are about democratic institutions, especially the legislature, which provides a vital link between citizens and government, and how this is linked to the legitimacy of and public support for the institution. The citizen perception of the legislature was then juxtaposed with the self-perception of the legislators themselves about their own role. The key results of the study show that between 75 to 80% support of citizens, majority of whom are drawn from the youth populations between 18 to 45 years, and composed of a roughly equal number of both genders, have good knowledge of the legislature, rank the roles of the legislature, and have high expectations in terms of delivering social services, contribute to economic growth, and solve problems with their constituents. The key results are highlighted as follows: show that citizens have high level of knowledge about the legislature and its core constitutional responsibilities, as reflected in 3% of the respondents. High level of knowledge about the work of the legislature in the core domains of its responsibilities, as reflected in 79% of the respondents. 60% of the respondents rank the roles of the legislature in descending order as follows: lawmaking, economic development, assisting in the developmental needs of their constituents, and attending to the personal problems of their constituents. Over 50% of the citizens have the perception that the legislature is an institutional pillar of democracy, and therefore they support the legislature as an institution. Over 70% of respondents indicates it has access to the legislature and that it will serve as a critical tool for fighting corruption, enable citizens to fully participate in public life, make governments more efficient, and help individuals exercise their fundamental human rights. Let me talk to some common misconceptions about the Nigerian legislature. Over the years, several misconceptions and misperceptions about the legislature have become so entrenched that it has become difficult to change them. Some of these include the budget of the National Assembly. This is perhaps one of the most persistent and vexatious issues that have dented the image of the National Assembly in Nigeria, with widespread presumptions that the budget of the National Assembly is not known. It is well known that the budget of the National Assembly, which has never risen above 150 billion naira since 1999, is a fraction of the budget of the federal government, much less than the budget of some ministries in the executive arm of government. As shown below, the aggregate budgets approved for National Assembly from 2005 to 2021 and the relative shares in the national budget. The budget trend upwards from 54.8 billion naira in 2006, except in 2009, peaking at 154 billion 369 in 2010. Thereafter, it stabilized at 150 billion naira each year. In 2015, 2016, and 2019, however, the aggregate allocation to the National Assembly dropped 120 billion naira and 115 billion naira respectively. In relative terms, the budget allocation to the National Assembly declined from 4.1% of the total federal budget in 2008 to 1.9% in the 2016 fiscal year. However, in the last 4 years, the percentage of the National Assembly budget in the federal budget ranged between 0.82%, that was in 2021, or the current budget, to 1.44% in 2019% of the federal government budget. The National Assembly, on the average, accounts for 2.81% of the national budget allocation over the 6 years between 2011 and 2016, and much less in the last 2 years. Between 2011 and 2014, the National Assembly attracted annual budgetary allocation of 100. Our recommendations for oversight undertaken by the legislature should be equally received, studied, and implemented by the executive as a measure of accountability. Accountability is the hallmark of modern democratic governance. Democracy remains on how some misperceptions about the legislature can be addressed. I am confident that if implemented, some of these recommendations can improve public participation and appreciation of the legislature, especially the National Assembly. 1. Introduce measures targeted at improving knowledge about the legislature among members of the public. This is important owing to the fact that low levels of knowledge of the legislature are a significant barrier to public engagement with the institution. This extends to an understanding of how the legislature and its committee work, as well as its day-to-day activities. 2. Introduce more measures that encourage public participation in the legislative process. It is important that detailed information about legislative activities and opportunities to be involved in the decision-making process should be made easily available to members of the public through a range of media, including a more detailed and interactive website, streaming of plenary and, of course, committee activities, use of newsletters and bulletins, legislative radio, etc. 3. Institutionalize courses on democracy and the legislature in secondary schools and institutions of higher learning to expose young Nigerians to legislative practice and procedure and stimulate their interest in the legislature. This would go beyond the piecemeal consideration of the matter that is going in subjects such as government. 4. Improve media reportage that is critical and in-depth rather than superficial and sensational. Nigerians have a right to know what their representatives are doing, and journalists have a responsibility to provide that information to them. In an era of fast headlines, fake news, and alternative facts, we must demand higher standards of our media men and women. 5. Establishment of well-structured and publicized platforms for public interaction between the Senate and the House and the public, for instance, through mechanisms such as school visits, quiz competitions, National Assembly Open Week, etc. Number 6, improve coverage of legislative activities both in plenary and committees with a view to presenting to the Nigerian people the dedication of the National Assembly in promoting good governance earlier either through lawmaking or oversight. And 7, continuous prioritization of laws and policies targeted at addressing real economic and social challenges facing Nigerians, including improving social services, as health and education, job creation, security of lives and property in communities, and poverty alleviation, etc. In conclusion, in this lecture, I have provided a detailed analysis of the legislature and legislative mandate with a specific reference to Nigeria. Furthermore, I examined public perception and declining trust in government institutions with a special focus on the legislature. The analysis and cross-country review showed that some of the reasons for the negative perception of the legislature include lack of interest in politics, the perceived opacity of the legislature and its processes, inadequate communication and interface with the public, and broader contextual issues such as poverty and unemployment. More to this, however, sometimes the negative perception of the legislature can be attributed to a lack of knowledge and understanding of the role of the legislature and how it contributes to democratic governance. On other occasions, the misperception is due to a lack of sufficient information on the part of the public or twisting of the information to deliberately damage the institution of the legislature. I have also pointed to the proclivity for both traditional and new media to focus on the sensational and frivolous as against the substance of legislative. And some of us here will remember the furniture allowance saga in 1999. And that was a huge sacrifice by members of the National Assembly then, but it was turned against them. And of course, the NLC had a field day. The paper proceeded to present some of the reality of legislative work and the efforts of the Ninth Assembly to deliver on its core mandate of making laws for the peace, order, and good governance of Nigeria by presenting some of the landmark achievements of the Ninth Assembly. The bulk of the laws passed by this Assembly are revolutionary and geared towards improving the economy, promoting peace and security, and protecting the social and economic rights of all Nigerians. I also discussed our achievements in the area of legislative oversight and highlighted the importance of harmonious executive-legislative relations in actualizing our legislative mandate and delivering good governance to our people. Finally, concrete recommendations have been made on how to address some of the recurrent misperceptions of the National Assembly in particular and the legislature at large. Thank you for your kind attention.